When I first heard that the $200 NFA tax was being eliminated, I thought it was just election year noise, until I saw the actual bill Trump signed on the 4th of July. Now the gun world's asking the same question. If the NFA doesn't raise a tax anymore, is it even legal? What's up, everyone? This is Ted from Line 45, and today, I'm unpacking how one signature might have just pulled the legal foundation out from under the National Firearms Act, and what that means for every suppressor, SBR, and form-filing gun owner in America. Before I start, I would really appreciate it if you would push those buttons below, the subscribe button, the notification bell, all of them. This is not necessary, but those little clicks help a brother out. Plus, it pushes me to give you more valuable car-related content on your screen. Now, buckle up, and let's get back to the video. When Trump signed the One Big Beautiful Bill on the 4th of July, I don't think many folks realized what was tucked inside until the ATF's own bulletin started circulating. Section 9823 quietly zeroed out the $200 transfer tax that's been stapled to suppressors, short-barreled rifles, and other NFA items since 1934. It's set to take effect on the 1st of January, 2026. But make no mistake, the political and legal firestorm kicked off the moment the ink dried. I've filed my share of Form 1S and Form 4S over the years, and that $200 has always been part of the cost of doing business with the NFA. It was annoying, sure, but it was the price for staying above board. Now that number is gone, and every attorney with a 2A focus is rereading the Constitution. Why? Because the only reason the National Firearms Act survived legal scrutiny in the first place was that it was a tax, not a ban. That's how the Supreme Court upheld it in Sonzinski versus United States back in 1937. The logic was simple. Congress can tax firearms, and you can regulate things through taxation. But when you collect $0, you're not taxing anything. You're just regulating by force, without constitutional backing. This isn't about scoring political points. It's about whether the core of federal gun control law still has a legal leg to stand on. For this to all make sense, I think I need to remind you what the NFA was originally designed to do, and why this change hits its foundation right between the eyes. Every time I filled out a Form 1, it's been hard not to think about why the NFA even exists. The National Firearms Act wasn't passed to ban anything outright. It was passed as a taxation and registry measure back in 1934. After the Prohibition era and a handful of high-profile crimes involving Tommy guns and sawed-off shotguns, lawmakers figured they couldn't get away with banning guns outright without bumping into the Second Amendment. So, they did what the government usually does when it wants control without accountability. They taxed it. That $200 fee back then was no joke. It was the equivalent of more than $4,000 today. And it wasn't just the cost. It was the paperwork, fingerprints, approval delays, and backlogged forms. For decades, the NFA operated under the legal theory that it was a valid use of Congress's taxing authority. That distinction matters a lot right now, because once that tax disappears, as it will in January 2026, the whole constitutional justification starts to unravel. If the federal government is no longer raising revenue from suppressors or short-barreled rifles, what authority does it have to demand fingerprints, registration, or approval? That's the legal crack forming beneath the NFA. And some folks aren't waiting around for the courts to answer that. They've already filed suit, and the arguments are getting traction. So, who's stepping into the ring now? Well, it didn't take long after the bill passed for the lawsuits to start flying. Gun Owners of America, Silencer Co., and the Firearms Policy Coalition filed suit in the Fifth Circuit within a week of the tax being zeroed out. I followed these groups for years, and while they don't always get mainstream attention, they know how to hit where it matters: case law and constitutional authority. And this time, they're aiming square at the NFA's heart. Their argument is straightforward. If the NFA isn't collecting a tax anymore, it has no legal standing under Congress's taxing power. What's fascinating is how cleanly this hits the precedent set in Sonzinski. That decision upheld the NFA because it raised revenue. Take that away, and suddenly, you're left with a regulatory regime masquerading as a tax system. That's not just semantics. Under modern constitutional interpretation, especially post-Bruin, any gun control measure has to meet a strict historical standard. and a law built entirely on a now-defunct tax might not pass muster. The Fifth Circuit is the same court that shut down the ATF's pistol brace rule earlier this year. It's become the new battleground for 2A litigation, and it's not unlikely that this case will land in the Supreme Court's lap by 2026. And that's where things could change for everyone: manufacturers, dealers, and regular folks like me who've been filling out Form 1S for years. But while the legal fight builds, there's another question on everyone's mind. Is the NFA even enforceable anymore if the tax is gone? That's where things start to get murky. I've heard this question at the range, in shops, and on forums nonstop the last few weeks. If they're not charging the $200 tax anymore, can they even make us file Form 1S or Form 4S? It's a fair question, and honestly, it doesn't have a clear answer yet. What we do know is that the tax is what gave the NFA its constitutional foundation. Without that, the registry, the approval process, and even the penalties for non-compliance are on shaky ground. That's not just my opinion. It's the argument that constitutional lawyers are starting to echo in legal journals and hearings. As of now, the ATF is still processing forms the same way, and the NFA registry hasn't gone anywhere. But come the 1st of January, 2026, once the tax officially hits zero, the government will be collecting personal data, approving firearm configurations, and enforcing felony-level penalties on something that no longer qualifies as a taxable item. That's a pretty big problem. The government might try to argue it still has authority under the Commerce Clause, but Bruin and Heller narrowed that playing field quite a bit. The ATF doesn't get to create law. If the foundation shifts beneath them, we're not just talking about a policy change. We're looking at the potential constitutional collapse of one of the longest-standing gun control laws in the country. And while the federal side starts wobbling, some states aren't waiting to see how it ends. They're already stepping up to fill the gap, and not in a good way. While some folks were celebrating the NFA tax repeal as a win for gun rights, I noticed certain state lawmakers started moving in the opposite direction, and fast. California, New York, Illinois, and a handful of others have already introduced or revived legislation to regulate suppressors, short-barreled rifles, and similar firearms at the state level. I spoke to a dealer buddy in New Jersey, and he told me straight, we're prepping for new paperwork even if the feds back off. These states see the writing on the wall, and if the federal registry loses its bite, they're getting ready to build their own. The problem is, once the NFA weakens, or falls entirely, states will feel pressure to pick up the slack in the name of public safety. But most of these states weren't even aligned with the federal NFA framework to begin with. California already bans suppressors. New York's restrictions go far beyond anything in the federal registry. Now imagine those same states getting even more aggressive without having to worry about conflict with federal law. It's not hard to see where this goes. And then there's enforcement. If the ATF's registry becomes unenforceable, state-level prosecutions and local agency raids could become more common, especially in blue jurisdictions looking to make headlines. For gun owners living in anti-gun states, it may mean less freedom, not more. Hence, while the legal ground may be shifting at the federal level, don't assume that means your state's going to follow suit. So, what does all this mean for everyday shooters, guys like you and me, who just want to stay legal? When laws shift, the first mistake most folks make is thinking it won't affect them until it does. I've had friends say that if the tax is going away, then they will just wait to file. And I get that. But this moment isn't just about saving $200. It's about understanding where you stand right now and how that could change depending on how courts and agencies respond over the next 6 to 12 months. If you've got an NFA item pending, whether it's a Form 1 for a shorty AR build or a Form 4 for that suppressor you've been waiting on, your paperwork is still legally binding, and the rules are still active until the 1st of January, 2026. That means nothing's free just yet. You'll still need a stamp to take possession, and skipping the process now thinking you'll be in the clear later is rolling the dice with a felony charge. Personally, I'm keeping all my forms clean and up to date until there's a hard decision from the courts. The last thing I want is a rifle I can't shoot or a suppressor that turns into a liability just because I got ahead of the system. If you're in a free state, things might loosen after January. But if you're in a restrictive one, start tracking your state legislature now. Because whether or not the federal government backs down, your local laws are still going to dictate what's actually in your safe and what isn't. What we're watching right now isn't just a tax adjustment. It's the first real structural threat to the NFA in nearly a century. If the courts side with GOA and Silencer Co., and the Fifth Circuit rules that a $0 tax strips the law of its constitutional authority, that decision could ripple all the way to the Supreme Court. And the legal landscape for gun owners could change overnight. Not because Congress repealed anything, but because the law lost its foundation. From a constitutional standpoint, that's a much more powerful shift, and it's not reversible by the next administration. If the NFA collapses, the implications are massive. Suppressors might no longer require a stamp or registration. The SBR category, arguably the most pointless distinction in American gun law, could vanish. Even short-barreled shotguns and AOWs, which have mostly existed in a weird legal limbo, would be legally neutralized. That doesn't mean chaos. It means a rollback of decades of bureaucratic drag that's never been tied to actual crime prevention. Still, this isn't a clean path forward. Expect resistance. Expect lawsuits. Expect blue states to lock down even tighter. But for federal law, we're already halfway down the slope. The NFA, without a tax, isn't the NFA. It's just an old piece of paper with no legal teeth. The door has opened. Whether the courts walk through it or slam it shut is coming soon. One way or another, this fight is going to define the next decade of Second Amendment law.